In the last video, we talked about the blues revivalist London blues club scene that was happening in the early 1960s in London, and the fact that people like Keith Richards and Mick Jagger were hanging around, Brian Jones, hanging around those clubs and were fantastic blues enthusiasts. Well, the Rolling Stones were formed out of that scene. They were very much the kind of junior partners, the young guys who were imitating the older guys who they went to see. And the band initially was led by Brian Jones. We think about the Rolling Stones as essentially being about Mick and Keith, but in fact, Brian Jones was the sort of the leader, and Brian Jones was really a true blues devotee. And so even when Keith Richards and Mick Jagger wanted to do tunes by Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly, you know, cover tunes of those, he was really quite suspicious of that. I mean, he was such a diehard that he felt like even that was selling out to commercialism. Almost like the folk enthusiasts in Greenwich Village in the United States during the early 1960s. If you were a blues enthusiast, you didn't want to be you didn't want to be perceived as being in it for the money or being in it for the fame. If you were a blues devotee during these days in the UK, you really wanted to be in it for the music itself. There's the famous story of Eric Clapton leaving the Yardbirds as they were recording their first single because the band wouldn't be on part of the record, and Eric Clapton just sort of took all this pop baloney and just said, forget it, I'm going to go woodshed and become a better blues player. And that's the kind of attitude that we're talking about here, the willingness to leave fame and fortune behind if it means that you're not being faithful to your blues calling. And so Brian Jones is that guy. Well, the band takes its name, the Rolling Stones, from the blues tradition, and then gets an established regular gig at the Crawdaddy Club, which was just right sort of adjacent to one of the train stations in central London. And it was a club that was run by a fellow named Giorgio Gomelsky. And for all intents and purposes, Giorgio Gomelsky thought he was managing the Rolling Stones. He didn't actually have a contract with them, but he thought, you know, we all understood what was going on. These guys are playing regularly at my club. I'm working as an advocate for it. That's what's going on. Turned out there was a guy who came along who used to work for Brian Epstein called Andrew Loog Oldham, who started managing the group and kind of left old Giorgio Gomelsky in the lurch there. He ended up picking up another group to play the Crawdaddy Club after the Rolling Stones had success. The name of that group was the Yardbirds, and with that group, he definitely signed a contract. But at this point in our story, the Rolling Stones are playing at the Crawdaddy Club, and you may recall me talking about Dick Rowe. He was the guy at Decca who set up the audition for the Beatles on January the 1st, 1962, and then passed on the audition tape, the tape that Brian Epstein ended up shopping all over London and couldn't get anybody to take until George Martin at Parlophone finally brought the group in for an audition and eventually signed them. Well, Dick Rowe is at a talent show or some kind of a thing like that where he's a celebrity judge as a representative from Decca, and George Harrison, after the Beatles' sort of first flush of success, is a celebrity judge. And as the story is often told, and who knows whether these stories are accurate, but this is probably the gist of it. I think it was George who likes to tell this story. He was talking to Dick Rowe, and Dick Rowe turned to him and said, you know, he was sorry that he'd passed on the Beatles, that George Harrison couldn't imagine how much trouble he'd gotten for that, and had developed a reputation for being the guy who passed on the Beatles, and you guys have gone on to have such great success, and it really makes me look foolish. So, is there somebody you know, a group that you're really high on that you know, that I might sign, or that you think would be a pretty good prospect? George Harrison says that he said to Dick Rowe, well, you might check out our friends, the Rolling Stones. They play down at the Crawdaddy Club down by the train station in London. And the way George Harrison used to like to tell the story, he sort of turned away because somebody else got his attention. When he turned back, Dick Rowe's chair was still spinning. He was gone. Well, in fact, however it turned out, Dick Rowe did go to see the Rolling Stones at the Crawdaddy Club, and he did sign them to Decca. And Giorgio Gomelsky was left out of the deal. It was Andrew Loog Oldham who made all that happen. What's interesting is that because the Beatles had the connection with Phil Spector, Andrew Loog Oldham got some advice from Phil Spector, and he said to the Rolling Stones, always own your master recordings. Just license them to the record company. And so that's what the Rolling Stones did. The British label didn't think there was anything peculiar about that that particular, I mean, they didn't do it with their other artists, but what's the deal? I mean, after a couple years, most pop music is going to be off the charts anyways. Who cares who owns the master recordings? But it was a great stroke of luck for the Rolling Stones to own all of their own master recordings, and they have. They've taken them from label to label in subsequent decades. Well, anyway, the Rolling Stones didn't have the kind of success in the U.S. immediately that the Beatles had. Their first records are primarily cover versions. Keith and Mick were not yet songwriters. And these were, the cover versions were split between rock and roll and rhythm and blues. Some important, interesting cover versions that made the UK charts, but not the US charts. In 1963, Come On, a cover of a Chuck Berry tune, went to number 21 in the UK. Going to number 3 in 1964 was their version of Buddy Holly's Not Fade Away. They even did a song that was written by them, especially by Lennon McCartney, who, you recall I told you, really wanted to be a songwriting team. So once they started to have success, they immediately trying to sell their songs to other artists. So they sold one to the Rolling Stones or got them to record it, I Want to Be Your Man, which went to number 12 in the UK in 1963. If you ever get a chance to hear the Rolling Stones version of I Want to Be Your Man and the Beatles version of I Want to Be Your Man, which they subsequently recorded, it really is a great case study in the difference between those two groups. I Want to Be Your Man by the Stones, much more blues-oriented. I Want to Be Your Man by the Beatles, much more sort of Motown sounding or Atlantic Records sounding, much more sort of vocal and polished. But Jagger and Richards soon started begin to write their own songs, and some of the first important Jagger Richards songs that appear on the charts are, of course, The Last Time, which is a #1 hit in the UK, #9 in the US in 1965. Of course, I Can't Get No Satisfaction from 1965 was also a Jagger Richards tune. They even sold a tune to Marianne Faithfull, who was at that time, you know, at some point in the 60s, Mick Jagger's girlfriend. As Tears Go By was a very big hit for her in 1964, #9 in the UK. You probably know the Rolling Stones version of that, but initially that was recorded by Marianne Faithfull, and she had a very big hit. So that really sort of tells us a bit about the Stones as their careers developed in the UK. Let's now turn to the success the Stones enjoyed in America and how that played for them. That's what we'll talk about in the next video.